In the final months of 1918, as the First World War dragged itself toward its bloody conclusion, the Argonne Forest of northeastern France became the stage for one of the most desperate, haunting, and unforgettable episodes in American military history, an episode that would be remembered simply as the story of the Lost Battalion. The forest itself was a nightmare of tangled branches, broken trees, mud thick enough to swallow boots, and fog so dense that entire companies vanished into it as if swallowed by the earth. It was a landscape sculpted by artillery fire, blackened by explosions, and soaked in the blood of soldiers from dozens of nations who had fought across it for years. Into this chaos the American First Army prepared its greatest offensive of the war, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, an operation intended to break the German lines once and for all and force an end to the conflict. And in the heart of this offensive marched the men of the 77th Division, a unit made up largely of immigrants from New York City, Italians, Irish, Jews, Poles, and men who had only recently arrived in America, eager to prove themselves worthy of the country they now called home. These men soon found themselves under the command of Major Charles Whittlesey, a quiet, stern, deeply disciplined lawyer who had volunteered for service and who believed fiercely in duty, responsibility, and refusing to yield no matter the cost. He was not a man of dramatic speeches or bold gestures. He inspired his men simply by standing firm, even in the face of danger. By early October, the 77th Division advanced into the Argonne Forest with orders to push through German defensive lines and reach open ground beyond the forest. The plan depended on coordination between multiple American units advancing side by side. But in the fog, smoke, confusion, and chaos of battle, that coordination quickly collapsed. Units lost contact with one another. Some were stalled by machine gun fire, others were pushed back by German counterattacks, and still others took heavy casualties and were forced to halt. But Whittlesey's battalion continued forward, unaware that the units on their flanks were no longer keeping pace. By October 2, 1918, Whittlesey and approximately 550 men had penetrated deeper into the forest than any other American force. They crossed ravines, climbed steep slopes, and pushed through thick brush that tore at their uniforms. The air was filled with the crack of rifles, the thump of mortars, and the relentless snarl of German machine guns hidden in camouflaged nests. Yet the men pressed onward, driven by orders, determination, and the belief that their brothers in arms advanced alongside them. It was only when they reached a small ravine near the Charlevoix mill that they realized their mistake. They had advanced too far. They were alone. The Germans quickly moved to surround the position, cutting off all escape routes. The Lost Battalion, as history would later call them, was now trapped behind enemy lines, isolated from friendly forces, and cut off from reinforcements, supplies, and communication. The ravine offered little shelter, just a cluster of shallow slopes, broken trees, and rocky ground. The men dug shallow holes, using their helmets as shovels, while German machine guns began to open fire from positions on the hills above them. Whittlesey ordered his men to hold their fire unless necessary. Ammunition was limited. Food was almost non-existent. Water came only from a small trickle of a stream that had already been contaminated by corpses and mud. The men were tired, hungry, frightened, but resolute. Their officers moved along the line, whispering words of encouragement. Many of the soldiers were barely more than boys, clutching their rifles with shaking hands as the forest echoed with the approaching footsteps of German patrols. The Germans quickly tightened their ring around the trapped Americans, bringing in more machine guns, snipers, and artillery. German officers believed they could crush the isolated battalion within hours. But the Americans refused to surrender. Whittlesey sent runners back toward American lines to request help, but one by one they disappeared into the forest, killed, captured, or lost. His only remaining method of communication was a handful of carrier pigeons, birds trained to fly back to command posts miles away. These pigeons became the lifeline of the Lost Battalion. As German artillery shells crashed around them and machine gun bullets cut through branches overhead, Whittlesey scribbled desperate messages onto small slips of paper and attached them to the pigeons' legs. The birds took flight, weaving through smoke and gunfire, carrying the fate of hundreds of men in their wings. Meanwhile, the situation in the ravine deteriorated rapidly. The Germans launched repeated assaults, testing the American defenses. Wave after wave of enemy soldiers emerged from the trees, firing rifles and hurling grenades. The Americans responded with everything they had: rifles, pistols, bayonets, even rocks when ammunition ran low. Bodies piled up along the edges of the ravine. Wounded men groaned in agony, some begging for morphine, others for water, others simply for their mothers. Medics worked tirelessly, tearing strips of cloth from their own uniforms to use as bandages. But supplies were running out, and the wounded lay in makeshift shelters without food, medicine, or hope of evacuation. As hours turned into days, the Germans realized that the trapped battalion would not break easily. So they shifted tactics. They began using psychological warfare, shouting in English that the Americans were surrounded and should save themselves. They launched more intense barrages of artillery, hammering the ravine with high-explosive shells that tore apart trees and showered the men with splintered wood. They even attempted to send envoys under a white flag to demand Whittlesey's surrender. But Whittlesey refused to respond, refused to speak, refused even to acknowledge the offer. He stood silently in the ravine, covered in dirt and smoke, his jaw clenched tightly. His men, watching him, took courage from his silence. But the worst moment came when the American artillery, unaware of the battalion's exact location, began shelling the ravine. Friendly fire rained down upon the trapped men, causing devastating casualties. Shell explosions lit up the dark forest, sending bodies flying and filling the air with screams. Whittlesey knew he had to act. With trembling hands, he wrote a desperate message for his last surviving carrier pigeon, a bird named Cher Ami. The message read, "We are along the road parallel to the 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." Cher Ami lifted into the sky as German soldiers opened fire, determined to bring the bird down. Bullets sliced through the air. Cher Ami was hit, dropping briefly toward the forest floor. But somehow, despite the wound, the bird stretched its wings and continued flying. The pigeon reached American lines with one eye destroyed, a leg nearly torn away, and its body bleeding, but the message was delivered. American artillery stopped firing on the ravine. Cher Ami would later be awarded honors and remembered as one of the heroes of the Lost Battalion. Yet even with friendly fire halted, the situation remained grim. The Americans were starving. Some chewed leaves. Others ate small chunks of leather from their gear. Water was filthy and made many sick. The dead lay beside the living, their bodies unburied because the men were too exhausted or under too much fire to move them. The stench filled the air. Flies swarmed. But the men held their position, clinging to the belief that reinforcements would come. And in fact, reinforcements were coming, slowly, painfully, through dense forest and heavy German resistance. Officers in the rear knew the situation was dire. They mobilized entire regiments to break through the German lines and reach Whittlesey's trapped men. But progress was slow. German snipers picked off advancing troops. Machine guns sowed chaos. The forest itself seemed to swallow entire units, leaving only confusion and bodies in its wake. Still, the Americans pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that hundreds of their brothers were trapped and dying. By the fourth day of encirclement, only about half of the Lost Battalion remained capable of fighting. Many were wounded. Others were delirious from lack of water. Yet when the Germans launched a final, desperate attack to break the remaining American will, the men fought with a ferocity born of survival. They repelled the assault, firing their last rounds, shouting, cursing, refusing to break. Finally, on October 7, 1918, American and Allied forces broke through the German lines and reached the ravine. What they found was a scene of unimaginable devastation, bodies everywhere, wounded men lying in mud, those still standing barely able to speak. Whittlesey, exhausted and pale, simply nodded as rescue forces arrived. The Lost Battalion was saved, but at a terrible cost. Of the original 550 men, fewer than 200 walked out of the ravine uninjured. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. This was the beginning. The rescue of the Lost Battalion did not mark the end of their struggle, but only the beginning of another kind of battle, one that unfolded not in the mud-choked ravine of the Argonne but in hospitals, recovery camps, and in the minds of the survivors who carried the memories of those 6 days for the rest of their lives. As stretcher teams moved through the ravine, lifting wounded men from the ground, many of the soldiers were too weak even to speak. They clutched at water canteens, their lips cracked and bleeding, their bodies trembling from hunger, fever, infection, and shock. Medics examined men who had fought through dehydration so severe that they could barely swallow. Some were hallucinating. Others stared blankly at the sky, their minds still trapped in the relentless hammering of gunfire that had surrounded them for days. Survivors described the rescue as surreal. One moment they were expecting another German charge, the next moment friendly faces were approaching through the trees, calling out in English, offering real water, real food, and the hope of escape. Those who could still walk were guided back through the forest in small groups, each accompanied by medical personnel and escorts carrying rifles in case of surprise German attacks. The wounded were placed on stretchers and carried over uneven ground, their bodies bouncing as the teams struggled through the thick brush. Occasional German shells still fell in the distance, and the smell of smoke hung in the air. Many soldiers wept quietly as they left the ravine, not in fear but from relief, exhaustion, and the overwhelming realization that they had survived something few would ever fully understand. Yet even as they walked away, many glanced back at the ravine where they had left behind so many comrades, where the ground itself had become a grave for dozens of men whose bodies could not be recovered immediately due to the constant danger. When Whittlesey and the remnants of his battalion reached the rear lines, officers, nurses, and soldiers from other units stared at them in stunned silence. The men looked like ghosts, thin, hollow-eyed, covered in dirt and dried blood. Their uniforms were shredded from crawling through underbrush. Their boots were falling apart. Some had not eaten a real meal in 6 days. They stood quietly as commanders approached them, offering words of praise they could barely hear. Whittlesey, his face gaunt and his voice barely above a whisper, gave a brief report on the status of his men. Those listening struggled to comprehend the extent of the ordeal the battalion had endured. Even seasoned officers who had fought in trench warfare recognized the unique brutality of what had unfolded in the Argonne ravine. As the men were moved to makeshift hospitals and medical tents, doctors worked through the night treating wounds infected by mud and shrapnel. Surgeons removed bullets under candlelight. Nurses washed the faces of men who had not seen clean water for nearly a week. Some soldiers finally allowed themselves to sleep deeply for the first time since entering the forest, collapsing onto cots and falling into heavy, dream-filled slumber. Others could not sleep at all, jolting awake at every noise, their minds replaying the relentless gunfire and explosions. The psychological toll became immediately apparent. Men who had once been confident and eager to fight now sat motionless, staring at nothing. The term shell shock was already known among medical staff, but the cases emerging from the Lost Battalion were some of the most severe they had seen. Meanwhile, word of the battalion's ordeal spread rapidly through the American Expeditionary Forces and eventually across the Atlantic. Newspapers in New York, Chicago, and Boston quickly learned of the trapped unit and published dramatic headlines describing their encirclement, their refusal to surrender, and their eventual rescue. Families read the stories with a mixture of pride and dread, scanning lists of survivors and casualties, praying that their sons, brothers, and husbands were among those who made it out alive. In immigrant neighborhoods of New York City, where many of the 77th Division's soldiers had grown up, church bells rang, strangers embraced, and flags were hung from windows. At the same time, countless families received telegrams informing them that their loved ones had been killed or wounded in the Argonne, turning their moments of hope into grief. In France, the military command recognized the Lost Battalion as a symbol of American bravery. General Pershing personally commended Whittlesey, who received the Medal of Honor along with several of his officers. But Whittlesey himself seemed uncomfortable with praise. When photographers asked him to pose, he did so with the stiff posture of a man who felt the burden of command more heavily than its honor. He knew how many men had died under his watch. He knew that decisions he made, following orders without hesitation, pushing forward into the forest, holding the ravine despite overwhelming odds, had caused enormous suffering even though they had also paved the way for eventual victory. His sense of duty was absolute, yet the heavy responsibility of so many lost lives haunted him. For the survivors, life in the recovery camps brought a brief respite but also new challenges. Many had shrapnel wounds that would never fully heal. Others had suffered nerve damage, infections, or illnesses caused by contaminated water. Some men experienced severe nightmares, waking in the middle of the night screaming, believing they were still surrounded by Germans. A few could not bring themselves to speak about the experience at all, preferring silence to the pain of remembrance. Commanders tried to reassign men to less dangerous duties, but many insisted on returning to their units once they recovered, driven by loyalty to their comrades and the belief that their suffering had only strengthened their resolve to see the war to its end. As the Meuse-Argonne offensive continued, the sacrifice of the Lost Battalion contributed directly to the collapse of the German defensive lines. Their daring advance had created a gap, a weak point in the German front that Allied forces exploited. In the final days of October and early November, American units surged forward across ground that had seemed impenetrable only weeks before. The Germans, exhausted, outnumbered, and demoralized by relentless pressure, began retreating toward the German border. And on November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent as the armistice was signed. The survivors of the Lost Battalion celebrated the end of the war with mixed emotions. Some rejoiced, laughing and cheering and drinking whatever they could find. Others sat quietly, reflecting on the friends who had not lived to see peace. Many felt relief, but also a strange emptiness. After so much suffering, the sudden absence of danger left them unsure of what came next. When they finally boarded ships to return to the United States, they were welcomed as heroes. Crowds gathered at docks, waving flags and cheering as the men disembarked. Parades were held in their honor. Bands played patriotic songs. Yet many of the soldiers found the attention overwhelming. They preferred to slip quietly back into their old neighborhoods, their old jobs, their old routines. But the war had changed them in ways their families and friends could not fully understand. Some survivors built successful lives, became husbands, fathers, business owners, or community leaders. Others struggled with trauma, poverty, or illness. The memories of the ravine followed them everywhere. For some, loud noises triggered panic. For others, certain smells brought back vivid flashbacks of death and destruction. A number of men turned to alcohol to drown their memories. Veterans' hospitals treated them as best they could, but the psychological understanding of trauma was still primitive, and many suffered alone. Major Whittlesey, hailed as a national hero, found civilian life especially difficult. He resumed his work as a lawyer, attended ceremonies, delivered speeches, and tried to fulfill the expectations placed upon him. But the ghosts of the Argonne ravine never left him. He received letters from families asking why their sons had died. He read newspaper stories exaggerating or misrepresenting the event. He carried a burden no praise could lift. Ultimately, the weight became too much. In 1921, unable to escape the memories and guilt that haunted him, Whittlesey ended his life by stepping from a ship into the ocean. His death shocked the nation. Newspapers mourned him as a fallen hero, and veterans recognized the tragedy for what it was, the final casualty of the Lost Battalion. Yet even in his death, Whittlesey's legacy remained one of courage and steadfastness. His refusal to surrender, his leadership under impossible conditions, and his unwavering loyalty to his men became legendary. The Lost Battalion became a symbol of American determination and resilience, a story taught to new generations of soldiers, a chapter written into the history of the Great War. The battlefield itself changed slowly over the decade. The ravine where the men had fought and bled grew over with trees and vines. Leaves covered the ground where bodies had once lain. Birds returned to the branches where machine gun fire had once echoed. Visitors walking through the forest years later found rusted scraps of metal, fragments of helmets, and the faint traces of trenches nearly swallowed by time. Monuments were erected near the site, honoring the men who had fought there. Family members traveled from America to lay flowers and stand silently in the place where their ancestors had suffered. As the First World War faded into history, the story of the Lost Battalion was kept alive by historians, veterans groups, and descendants determined to honor their memory. Books were written, films produced, and documentaries created, each retelling the ordeal with new insight. The battalion became a symbol not only of bravery but of the harsh realities of war, the confusion, the miscommunication, the terrible cost of decisions made in the fog of battle. It stood as a reminder that heroism is often born not from glory but from survival, endurance, and the refusal to surrender even when abandoned and outnumbered. The legacy of the Lost Battalion deepened further in the decades that followed. Military academies studied the battle as an example of both the potential and the dangers of aggressive tactics. Leaders examined the failures of communication that led to the encirclement, as well as the courage and discipline that allowed the survivors to hold out. The story became part of the collective memory of the First World War, shared alongside Verdun, the Somme, and Gallipoli, chapters of suffering that shaped the modern world. Yet beyond the military analysis, beyond the medals, beyond the history books, the story of the Lost Battalion remained, at its core, a human story. It was the story of immigrants fighting for a country that had not yet fully accepted them but which they proudly served. It was the story of young men who entered the forest with confidence and emerged forever changed. It was the story of leadership tested in the harshest crucible of war. It was the story of endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. And it was a story that continued to echo across generations. In the years after the war, as the United States moved into the 1920s with its booming cities, roaring factories, and a population eager to forget the horrors of Europe, the Lost Battalion lived on as a reminder of what the nation had endured and what its soldiers had sacrificed in muddy trenches and dark forests far from home. The public fascination with the battalion grew as newspapers retold the story, sometimes embellishing the details, sometimes highlighting the heroism while ignoring the suffering. Veterans found themselves invited to banquets, concerts, speeches, and civic events where they were asked to stand and be applauded. Many stood silently, nodding politely, feeling a disconnect between the cheers of the crowd and the screams they remembered in the ravine. To many of them, the medals and parades were hollow compared to the memory of the men who never returned. Some members of the battalion found comfort in each other, forming tight-knit communities in the cities where they lived. In New York, groups of survivors met in small bars tucked between tenements and corner shops. They shared drinks, smoked cigars, and exchanged stories, some humorous, some tragic, some too painful to speak of directly. They relied on each other more than on anyone else, because only another man who had been in the ravine could understand the nightmares that lingered, the guilt that gnawed at their quiet moments, the feeling of having left behind brothers who could not be saved. These men formed a brotherhood stronger than blood, bound by 6 days that defined their lives. The immigrant backgrounds of many soldiers in the 77th Division made their story resonate across diverse communities. In Jewish neighborhoods of the Lower East Side, families spoke with pride of their sons who had fought bravely in France. In Italian, Irish, and Eastern European communities, Men who had once been factory workers or dock laborers were hailed as heroes. Many had fought not only for America but for the chance to prove that they belonged in the fabric of the nation. Their courage became a point of pride for families who faced discrimination or hardship in their daily lives. The Lost Battalion came to symbolize the idea that America's strength came from its diversity, from the willingness of people from all walks of life to stand together under a common flag. Yet not all men returned home to praise and recognition. Some returned to poverty, struggling to find work in cities that offered few opportunities to veterans. The psychological scars of the Argonne ravine made it difficult for some to hold steady jobs. A few men drifted from city to city, avoiding crowds, living quietly on the margins of society. Others turned to alcohol to numb the memories. At the time, medical understanding of trauma was limited, and little support existed for men suffering from what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress. They were expected to return to normal life, to smile, to work, to raise families, even as their minds remained trapped in the forest where they had fought for their lives. Major Whittlesey remained a tragic figure in the years following the war. His public persona as a calm, steadfast leader contrasted sharply with the turmoil he carried inside. He received letters from families asking why their sons had died. He received invitations to ceremonies where he was praised for courage that had come at an unimaginable price. He found the weight of expectation unbearable. He avoided the spotlight as much as he could. He rarely discussed the war in detail. And when he died by suicide in 1921, the nation was forced to confront the reality that heroism often came with invisible wounds. His funeral was attended by thousands. Veterans stood in silence. Families he had comforted wept openly. Newspapers described him as a fallen hero whose suffering had outlasted the war. His death became a symbol of the unseen cost of combat, a reminder that the war continued to take lives long after the armistice. The men who had served under him mourned deeply, some traveling long distances to pay their respects. They spoke of him quietly, with reverence, remembering the man who had refused to surrender even when surrounded, who had stood tall while bullets sliced through the trees around him, who had believed in duty above all else. Whittlesey's legacy became inseparable from that of the battalion he had led into the abyss and brought back from the brink. As the 1920s turned into the 1930s, memorials began to appear across the United States honoring the Lost Battalion. Plaques were mounted in city halls. Statues were erected in parks. Schools were named after soldiers who had died in the ravine. The battalion became part of the mythology of the Great War, a story retold to inspire patriotism, courage, and resilience. Military academies studied the battle not only as an example of bravery but also as a lesson in the dangers of miscommunication and the importance of coordination. The story of the battalion was taught to new generations of soldiers, many of whom would go on to fight in another global war only decades later. Meanwhile, in France, the Argonne Forest remained scarred by the conflict. Although nature slowly reclaimed the land, the ravine where the Lost Battalion had been trapped retained a solemn, haunting atmosphere. Pilgrims traveled from America to visit the site. Some came seeking closure for family members who had died there. Others came out of respect, to walk the ground where so much courage and suffering had taken place. Guides led visitors through dense trees and overgrown pathways, pointing out rusted shell fragments, rotted trenches, and the faint outlines of defensive positions. Over time, a monument was erected near the ravine, a simple stone marker honoring the battalion and the sacrifices they made. Visitors left flowers, flags, and handwritten notes, turning the site into a place of remembrance. The passage of time did not diminish the power of the story. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, journalists and historians began drawing parallels between the struggles of a new generation of soldiers and the ordeal of the Lost Battalion. Veterans of the 77th Division, older now and hardened by experience, watched the news with a sense of grim recognition. They wrote letters to young soldiers, sharing advice, encouragement, and warnings about the realities of battle. Some re-enlisted despite their age, wanting to serve again. Others volunteered for civil defense roles or war production jobs, eager to contribute in any way they could. During the Second World War, the story of the Lost Battalion gained new meaning as American soldiers once again fought in Europe. The bravery displayed by Whittlesey's men became a standard against which new acts of valor were measured. Military leaders referenced the battalion in speeches, reminding troops of the legacy they carried. The story resonated especially among soldiers fighting in the dense forests of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, who saw in the Lost Battalion a reflection of their own struggles against encirclement and overwhelming odds. After the war, as America entered a period of prosperity and transformation, the Lost Battalion remained a cherished part of the nation's historical consciousness. Veterans organizations preserved the memory of the battalion through reunions, newsletters, and oral history projects. Surviving soldiers shared their stories with younger generations, hoping to ensure that the lessons of the war would never be forgotten. Their accounts offered not only tales of heroism but of humility, friendship, fear, and endurance. In the post-war decades, scholars began to study the battalion with renewed interest. They examined military records, letters, diaries, and reports to reconstruct the events of October 1918 in greater detail than ever before. They uncovered new insights into the decisions made by commanders, the role of terrain in the battle, and the hardships faced by the men. They also highlighted the diversity of the 77th Division, showing how the battalion represented the melting pot of America, a unit composed of men from dozens of ethnic backgrounds who fought together as brothers. Hollywood eventually turned its attention to the Lost Battalion, producing films and documentaries that brought the story to a wider audience. These dramatizations captured the imagination of viewers and helped solidify the battalion's place in popular culture. Actors portrayed Whittlesey and his men, recreating the harrowing scenes of the ravine, the desperate messages carried by pigeons, the relentless German assaults, and the final rescue. Though Hollywood often took artistic liberties, the core message remained. The story of the Lost Battalion was one of extraordinary courage. As the 20th century drew to a close, the number of surviving members of the battalion dwindled to only a handful. Those who remained were elderly, their memories fragile but still sharp enough to recall the horrors of the Argonne. They spoke to students, journalists, and historians, ensuring that the story would not fade. When the last survivors passed away, the nation mourned not only their loss but the passing of a living link to the Great War. Yet the memory lived on. Today, the Lost Battalion is remembered as one of the defining episodes of American military history. Museums feature exhibits dedicated to their ordeal. Schools teach the story as part of World War I history. Military cadets study the battle for lessons in leadership, perseverance, and tactical awareness. The monument in the Argonne Forest remains a place of quiet reflection, visited by travelers from around the world. What gives the story its lasting power is not just the heroism displayed by the soldiers, but the humanity at its core, the fear, the determination, the sacrifice, the leadership shown by Whittlesey, the camaraderie that kept the men going, the suffering they endured, and the tragedy that followed many of them home. It is a story of a group of ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances who fought not for glory but for survival and for each other. Their legacy endures because it speaks to something universal in the human spirit: the will to stand firm even when surrounded, the courage to hold the line when all seems lost, and the enduring truth that some acts of bravery echo across a century. As the decades passed and the world moved through wars, depressions, political upheavals and periods of peace, the story of the Lost Battalion continued to evolve, not as a relic of a distant war but as a living narrative that shaped how Americans understood courage, sacrifice, and the human cost of conflict. Long after the last rifle had been fired in the Argonne, the forest itself transformed, reclaiming the ravine where the men had once fought. Moss grew where blood had once soaked the earth. Trees rose where shattered stumps had marked the violence of artillery fire. Birds returned to branches that had once been stripped bare by machine-gun bullet. Yet beneath the foliage, the ground still carried the memory of those desperate days, as if the land itself refused to forget the ordeal endured by Whittlesey and his men. In the United States, the Lost Battalion became part of the national consciousness through stories told in classrooms, through plaques in veterans' halls, through parades on Memorial Day, and through quiet conversations among families who remembered the names of men who never came home. Every generation rediscovered the tale in its own way. Teachers explained to students how a unit had been cut off in the depths of a hostile forest, surrounded by German forces on all sides, left with no food or ammunition, yet refused to surrender. Parents told their children about the bravery of immigrants who had fought for a nation still learning what it meant to be American. Veterans invoked the story when speaking of resilience and unity under fire. It became more than a military event. It became a moral example, a reminder that heroism often arises not from strategy or numbers but from the determination of individuals faced with impossible choices. In the 1950s and 60s, when the United States faced new conflicts in Korea and Vietnam, soldiers looked back on the Lost Battalion as a symbol of steadfastness. Military instructors referenced the ravine when teaching new recruits about holding positions under pressure, maintaining discipline in isolation, and resisting the psychological tactics of a surrounding enemy. Combat veterans saw in the battalion a reflection of their own hardships, units cut off in mountains, valleys, or jungles, forced to survive with what little they had, relying on teamwork and instinct. The emotional connection to the Lost Battalion strengthened as modern soldiers realized that the suffering endured in the Argonne was not unique to World War I but part of a timeless pattern of human endurance in war. As the decades rolled forward, historians deepened their exploration of the battalion's ordeal. They examined diaries found years after the war, sometimes in dusty attics, sometimes in family trunks that had not been opened in generations. These diaries revealed intimate details of the men's experiences, moments of fear, hope, grief, and unexpected humor. Some entries described the terror of artillery shells exploding overhead. Others spoke of the hunger, the thirst, the exhaustion. One diary, written by a young soldier from Brooklyn, recorded the moment he realized that the battalion was surrounded. Another described the agony of watching friends die and being unable to help. These personal testimonies brought the story to life in ways that official reports could not, reminding future generations that the battalion's courage was not abstract but deeply human. Veterans organizations made a concerted effort to preserve artifacts related to the battalion. Helmets dented by shrapnel, canteens pierced by bullets, maps smudged with mud and sweat, and fragments of uniforms were collected and displayed in museums across the country. Visitors gazed at these objects with reverence, imagining the hands that had once held them, the lives that had depended on them. Children stared wide-eyed at photographs showing the weary faces of the survivors, their expressions marked by suffering yet illuminated by the unspoken bond that tied them together. These exhibits became powerful tools for teaching not only history but empathy, allowing modern audiences to connect emotionally with men who had lived a century earlier. In the Argonne itself, the French government and local communities made efforts to honor the battalion. They cleared pathways, erected memorial markers, and created signs guiding visitors to the exact spot where Whittlesey's men had made their stand. French children learned about the battalion in school, understanding that the men who had fought in the ravine were part of the larger story of liberation. Pilgrims from America visited the site each year, often carrying small flags, photographs, or flowers to leave at the monument. They walked quietly along the forest paths, imagining the chaos of war in a place that now seemed peaceful. Many described feeling an almost spiritual presence, as if the forest itself held the memories in its roots and branches. The more time passed, the more clear it became that the Lost Battalion was not simply a military incident but a cultural touchstone, a story that shaped how Americans understood bravery. Yet the story also evolved in a way that reflected the growing awareness of the costs of war. In the later 20th century, as society began to understand psychological trauma more deeply, the battalion's ordeal was reinterpreted through the lens of mental health. Scholars emphasized not only the bravery of the men but the emotional scars they carried. They examined how Whittlesey's suicide symbolized the lingering pain of combat. They studied letters written by survivors who described struggling with nightmares, anxiety, guilt, and the feeling of never fully leaving the forest behind. This new perspective did not diminish the battalion's heroism but added a layer of complexity, reminding the world that courage does not erase trauma and that sacrifice often continues long after the battlefield is silent. Literature and film played a significant role in preserving the story. Each new decade produced its own interpretations, novels that dramatized the encirclement, films that brought the battle to life on screen, documentaries that pieced together the events with interviews and archival footage. These retellings varied in tone and accuracy, but all shared the same underlying message. The Lost Battalion represented the endurance of the human spirit. Whenever audiences watched actors portray Whittlesey standing firm while surrounded on all sides, they were reminded of the quiet, steady courage that had defined the battalion from the first moment it entered the forest. On anniversaries of the battle, ceremonies were held across the United States. Veterans gathered to honor the memory of the men who had fought in the ravine. Local communities organized events in honor of soldiers whose families lived in the area. Schoolchildren recited poems, performed musical pieces, and read letters written by the battalion's survivors. Flags were lowered, wreaths were laid, and the names of the fallen were read aloud, ensuring that none would be forgotten. For many families, these ceremonies were deeply personal, offering them a chance to reconnect with ancestors they had never met but whose courage had shaped their family's identity. As the 21st century began, digital archives expanded access to records of the battalion. Historians digitized photographs, service records, letters, and diaries, allowing people around the world to learn the story firsthand. Genealogists traced the descendants of the battalion's soldiers, connecting long-separated branches of families bound together by the shared legacy of the ravine. Scholars analyzed the tactical aspects of the battle using modern methodologies, revealing new insights into how terrain, communication failures, and leadership decisions shaped the fate of the battalion. Meanwhile, military institutions continued to study the battle as a classic example of determination under siege. Even as society changed and warfare evolved beyond recognition, the story of the Lost Battalion remained relevant. Modern soldiers deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflict zones recognized familiar themes in the battalion's ordeal: the uncertainty of combat, the challenges of communication, the emotional strain of watching comrades fall. The Lost Battalion became a bridge between eras, linking the doughboys of 1918 to the soldiers of the 21st century. Its lessons endured: trust in leadership, reliance on comrades, and the refusal to surrender even when surrounded. And yet the story's lasting power lay not only in its military implications but in its humanity. It was the story of men who suffered unimaginable hardship yet stood firm. It was the story of immigrants who fought for a nation they hoped to call home. It was the story of a leader whose burden was too heavy for any one man to bear. It was the story of survival, brotherhood, sacrifice, and the fragile line between heroism and tragedy. The Lost Battalion became timeless because it captured the essence of war in a single event: the chaos, the courage, the loss, the resilience, the cost, and the legacy. It became a reminder that in the darkest valleys of conflict, there are moments when ordinary men rise to extraordinary heights, shaping history not through grand strategy but through the simple, stubborn act of holding their ground. And as long as people continue to seek examples of human strength, the story of the Lost Battalion will continue to echo across generations, carried forward not only by books, films and monuments but by the enduring desire to remember those who stood against the impossible and refused to give in. As the world entered a new century and the memory of the First World War drifted further into the past, the lost voices of the Argonne began to take on a new life through the people who refused to let their story fade. The Lost Battalion, once just a unit designation in a vast conflict, now existed as a symbol, one that schools, historians, filmmakers, veterans, and families continued to breathe life into, ensuring that the ravine in France where 500 Americans were surrounded for 6 brutal days remained more than just a forgotten piece of land lost beneath moss and fallen leaves. It remained instead a place where courage, suffering, and brotherhood converged in a way that no passing year could erase. In the early 2000s, researchers returned to the Argonne with modern tools and renewed determination to document every detail of what had happened there. Using ground scans, aerial mapping, and metal detecting surveys, they found forgotten shell fragments, remnants of barbed wire, discarded rifle parts, and rusted tin cans that had once held the last food the soldiers ate before hunger overtook them. Archaeologists treated the site like a sacred ground rather than an old battlefield, carefully brushing soil away from artifacts that had not seen sunlight in nearly a century. Their discoveries confirmed details in diaries and military reports, and even shed new light on how the battalion's defensive positions had formed under fire. It became clear that the men had dug their foxholes not randomly but in tight arcs around the ravine's natural slope, giving themselves the narrowest possible angle of protection against German machine guns. Historians began collaborating with descendants of the soldiers, gathering letters preserved in attics, photographs kept in drawers, and medals tucked away in old jewelry boxes. These family treasures revealed layers of humanity that official war records could never capture. Some letters described the soldiers' first impressions of France, its fields, its villages, its strange beauty even during wartime. Others were written just days before the encirclement, the handwriting full of confidence and youth. A few final letters, written in shaky lines during the days of starvation and fear, spoke of hope, loyalty, and the unbroken belief that they would not be forgotten even if they died in the forest. Reading these letters nearly a century later brought tears to the eyes of descendants who suddenly felt connected to ancestors they had never met. The descendants formed groups dedicated to preserving the battalion's memory. They organized reunions, not for the veterans, who had all passed on, but for the families who carried their legacy. At these gatherings, great-grandchildren met one another and traced the paths their ancestors had taken from the tenements of New York to the trenches of France. Some brought uniforms, dog tags, trench knives, and other relics that had been passed down through generations. Others brought only stories, photographs, or names written in faded ink. Together, they rebuilt the battalion's identity piece by piece, transforming it from a historical event into a personal inheritance shared across families. During these years of renewed study, scholars re-evaluated the tactical significance of the battalion's ordeal. They noted how the battalion's stubborn stand helped to fracture German defensive lines, forcing the enemy to divert much-needed troops and resources to eliminate the isolated Americans. This unexpected delay gave other American units time to advance, contributing to the collapse of the German position in the Argonne and accelerating the final drive of the war. Modern military planners studied the encirclement as a cautionary tale about the dangers of advancing without communication or flank support, but also as a shining example of what disciplined troops could accomplish under impossible odds. The figure of Major Charles Whittlesey also underwent reassessment. Long depicted solely as a stoic hero, modern scholars explored the emotional weight he carried, the impossible decisions he had been forced to make, and the psychological toll of surviving when so many under his command had not. Letters written by Whittlesey after the war revealed a man who struggled deeply with survivor's guilt. He apologized to families even though he had nothing to apologize for. He questioned his choices even though those choices had saved lives. His suicide in 1921, once described as the sad end of a hero, was now understood through the lens of trauma. Whittlesey's story became a crucial part of discussions about mental health in the military, reminding the world that leadership in combat carries burdens long after the battlefield grows quiet. As research expanded, the story of the Lost Battalion gained international attention. Documentaries created by European filmmakers explored the event from the perspective of both American and German soldiers, highlighting how the brutality of the forest had affected both sides. Interviews with historians, dramatic voiceovers of diary entries, and reconstructed battlefield models helped audiences visualize the chaos and claustrophobia of the ravine. Museums in France added new exhibits dedicated to the battalion, featuring artifacts uncovered in archaeological digs and interactive maps showing troop movements. Visitors from around the world walked through these exhibits, learning how a small group of men trapped in a forest had left an imprint so large it could still be felt a century later. In the United States, television networks and streaming platforms produced dramatized retellings of the story. Actors portraying Whittlesey, McMurtry, Holderman, and the other officers reenacted the desperate defense of the ravine. Special effects recreated the darkness, the rain, the sensation of shells exploding overhead, and the exhausting weight of fear and hunger. These productions introduced millions of viewers to a story they may never have encountered otherwise. Many were shocked to learn that the soldiers had survived not only the Germans but friendly artillery fire that nearly wiped them out because of failed communication. Even more were moved by the role of Cher Ami, the pigeon who carried the final desperate message through fire, losing an eye and part of a leg yet surviving long enough to save the battalion. By the 2010s, the centennial of the First World War approached, sparking a surge of interest in the battalion. Schools organized projects where students researched individual soldiers, reconstructing their lives from census records, immigration documents, draft cards, and battlefield reports. These young researchers learned that many soldiers had been first-generation Americans, working-class men who had left behind factory jobs, bakery shifts, family-owned shops, and labor on the docks to fight for a country they barely knew. Students produced videos, podcasts, and essays that breathed new life into the memories of soldiers who had been silent for a century. Their work ensured that the century-old story reached new generations who knew little about World War I but who now felt deeply connected to the men of the Lost Battalion. In New York, where the 77th Division had been formed, the battalion's legacy became a point of civic pride. Exhibits were installed at local museums, plaques were restored, and entire school lessons were built around the story. Community centers in neighborhoods once home to the battalion's immigrant soldiers hosted lectures and film screenings. Streets were named after Whittlesey and others. The battalion became a symbol of the city's diversity and resilience, reflecting the idea that New York's strength had always come from the wide range of cultures and backgrounds that made up its population. As time passed, the battalion's story also found a place in discussions about immigration and national identity. Writers pointed out that many of the men who had fought in the ravine, Jews, Italians, Russians, Irish, Poles, had arrived in America only years before. Some barely spoke English. Some were discriminated against in their own neighborhood. Yet they had fought bravely, proving through their actions that patriotism was not defined by birth but by the willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. This perspective added depth to the battalion's legacy, transforming it from a simple war story into a reflection of what America had been and what it continued to strive to be. In France, the ravine remained a place of quiet pilgrimage. The trees grew tall and the undergrowth thickened, but the air still held a solemn stillness. Visitors walked along narrow paths, listening to the whisper of leaves and imagining the shouts and explosions that had once filled the air. Some described the sight as peaceful. Others felt the weight of history pressing around them. The presence of the battalion lingered like a shadow across the landscape, a reminder that even the most tranquil places can hold memories of suffering. Modern military training incorporated lessons drawn directly from the battalion's ordeal. Officers studied the importance of communication, reconnaissance, and understanding terrain. Soldiers learned how quickly a unit could become isolated and how critical leadership became in those moments. Discussions about the battalion often shifted toward themes of unity and morale, the intangible strength that kept men fighting even when they were starving, wounded, exhausted, and outnumbered. The Lost Battalion became not only a story of hardship but a case study in mental toughness, discipline, and belief. Even among civilians, the battalion's story took on new meaning. Writers explored the psychological dimensions of survival. Philosophers debated the nature of heroism. Artists painted scenes of the ravine using somber tones and streaks of light breaking through the dense foliage. Musicians composed orchestral pieces inspired by the pounding rhythm of artillery and the quiet, haunting resilience of the men who endured it. The story transcended military history and became part of cultural expression, shaping art, music, literature, and film. By the time a full century had passed since the 6 days in the Argonne, the Lost Battalion had become more alive in memory than it had ever been while the men themselves were still living. The centennial events held across the world brought together descendants, historians, veterans, diplomats, and visitors from dozens of countries. Wreaths were placed at monuments. Speeches were given. Names were read aloud. Bells rang through the forest. For a moment, the world paused to honor the men who had been trapped in a ravine and who had refused to give up even as death encircled them. In that moment of reflection, the legacy of the Lost Battalion became clear. It was a story of courage that defied the odds, of leadership tested beyond human limits, of unity among men who came from vastly different backgrounds. It was a reminder that history is shaped not only by generals and grand strategies, but by the endurance of ordinary soldiers who stand together when everything around them collapses. It was proof that even in the darkest corners of war, courage can illuminate the path forward. And so, the Lost Battalion endures, etched in memory, preserved in history, and carried forward by generations who refuse to let the voices of those 500 men disappear into silence. Their story remains a beacon across time, shining through the fog of history like a signal fire in the night, reminding us that bravery is timeless, sacrifice is eternal, and the human spirit, when pushed to its limits, can rise above even the deepest ravines of despair. As the world moved further into the 21st century, the story of the Lost Battalion continued to resonate in ways that few events from the distant past ever could. What had begun as a desperate struggle for survival in a forgotten ravine had grown into a narrative that stretched across continents, generations, and cultures, a story that people returned to not because of its violence but because of its humanity. The men who had fought and suffered in the Argonne no longer lived, their voices long silenced by time, but their presence lingered like a quiet echo in museums, in books, in reenactments, in monuments, and in the hearts of families who still spoke their names. The ravine itself grew older, its soil enriched by a century of fallen leaves, its trees reaching upward as if lifting the memory of those men toward the sky. Every year, small groups of visitors continued to walk the narrow path into the ravine, stepping carefully over roots and stones worn smooth by countless feet. Some were tourists drawn by curiosity. Others were scholars or military enthusiasts who had studied the maps, the troop movements, the topography, the tactical failures and triumph. But many were simply people seeking connection, descendants of the soldiers, or descendants of the soldiers' friends, or people who had no personal link to the battalion yet felt compelled to stand in the place where ordinary men had shown extraordinary resolve. The forest enveloped these visitors in its quiet embrace, the soft rustle of leaves and distant birdsong mixing with the heavy awareness of history. For many, it felt less like a battlefield and more like a place of reflection, a natural cathedral shaped by time and memory. In schools around the world, the Lost Battalion became part of lessons on leadership, perseverance, and the human cost of war. Teachers explained the conditions the men faced: hunger, thirst, isolation, encirclement, and how they managed to maintain discipline and morale despite overwhelming odds. Students listened with wide eyes as they learned how the men refused to surrender, how messages were sent by pigeon through a storm of bullets, how comrades shared the last drops of water in their canteens. These lessons sparked discussions about courage, duty, and the meaning of sacrifice. In classrooms where the faces of students reflected dozens of nations and cultures, the battalion's diversity offered a poignant reminder of how people from different backgrounds can unite under a common purpose. The battalion became more than a historical example; it became a blueprint for integrity and resilience. Universities held seminars and conferences where historians and military scholars dissected every aspect of the encirclement. They analyzed the communication breakdown that led to the battalion's isolation, the terrain that shaped the battlefield, the German tactics used to contain the Americans, and the psychological dimensions of being cut off with no hope of reinforcement. These academic explorations revealed the tragedy behind the heroism, how miscalculations, confusion, and fog of war chaos had contributed to the battalion's ordeal. Yet even amid this clinical analysis, the scholars acknowledged that numbers and tactics alone could not explain how the battalion survived. Something deeper had sustained the men: trust, unity, courage that went beyond military doctrine. Writers and poets continued to draw inspiration from the battalion, crafting narratives that blended fact and emotion into works that captured the essence of the ordeal. One poem described the forest as a cradle of shadows and steel, another portrayed Whittlesey as a lighthouse in a storm of fire. Novelists reimagined the soldiers' final hours before rescue, giving voice to the unnamed men who had fought and died in the ravine. These creative works kept the battalion alive in the cultural imagination, giving modern audiences new ways to engage emotionally with a century-old story. Meanwhile, modern descendants used digital platforms to share photographs, letters, and stories passed down through their families. Social media pages dedicated to the Lost Battalion gained followers from around the world: history lovers, veterans, students, descendants, and people who had stumbled upon the story and felt moved by its depth. Online discussions explored the battalion from every angle: military strategy, personal stories, psychological trauma, the experience of migrants in early 20th century America, the nature of leadership in crisis. What had once been a battlefield narrative now lived in a thriving digital community that honored the memory of the men not by mythologizing them, but by understanding them as real individuals shaped by their time, their culture, and their choices. One of the most profound legacies of the Lost Battalion emerged not in military doctrine or historical scholarship, but in the evolving conversation about trauma and mental health. Modern psychologists and veterans advocates looked back on the battalion and saw clear signs of what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They studied Whittlesey's letters, the testimonies of survivors, the reports of nightmares, anxiety, depression, and the lasting numbness that many soldiers described. These accounts became part of training materials for therapists working with veterans, illustrating how trauma can persist long after the last shot is fired. Whittlesey's suicide, once viewed as an isolated tragedy, became a powerful example of the unseen wounds carried by wartime leaders. His story became a call to action, inspiring efforts to better support modern soldiers dealing with psychological scars. In the decades after the centennial, new generations continued to discover the Lost Battalion, drawn to its themes of loyalty, resilience, and humanity. Video creators produced documentaries on streaming platforms, using modern visuals to bring the ravine to life. Animators reconstructed troop movements using realistic 3D maps. Archivists digitized more letters, diaries, and service records, making them accessible to anyone with an internet connection. Teachers built interactive lessons, asking students to imagine what they would have done in the soldier's place. Veterans organizations placed QR codes at memorials, linking visitors to detailed histories, photographs, and testimonies. Technology did not replace the story's emotional power, it amplified it, ensuring that the battalion's legacy would reach audiences far beyond what earlier generations could have imagined. In France, the ravine became increasingly recognized as a historical sanctuary. Conservationists worked to protect the land from development, ensuring that the forest would remain as undisturbed as possible. Volunteers cleaned paths, restored signage, and created guided audio tours accessible through smartphones. Some visitors left notes tucked into the bark of trees or stones placed gently on the memorial, small tokens of gratitude for men they had never met. On quiet days, when sunlight broke through the canopy and the forest floor glowed with soft green light, the ravine seemed almost suspended between eras, a timeless reminder of not only what had happened but why it mattered. As time pressed onward, the power of the Lost Battalion story endured because it captured something fundamental about the nature of humanity. It spoke of ordinary men rising to extraordinary heights. It spoke of leadership that held firm under impossible conditions. It spoke of friendship forged in darkness, of sacrifice made without hesitation, of courage discovered in the depths of fear. But it also spoke of the cost, of the pain carried home, of the lives cut short, of the burdens borne by survivors. It showed that heroism is never simple, that it comes with shadows as well as light. And perhaps that is why the story remained relevant long after every eyewitness had passed. In a world that often changed too quickly, the Lost Battalion offered a constant reminder of what mattered most: character, resilience, unity, compassion. In the faces of those 500 men, people saw reflections of themselves, their families, their communities, their shared humanity. The ravine in the Argonne became more than just a battlefield. It became a symbol of endurance, a metaphor for every struggle in which people find themselves surrounded by darkness yet refuse to surrender hope. 100 years after the battle, and then 110, and then 120, the story still lived on, not as an echo fading into history but as a voice speaking clearly across time, reminding each generation that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to stand firm in spite of it. The Lost Battalion became a testament to the truth that bravery can rise from the most unlikely places, that sacrifice can shape the future even when it goes unseen, and that the human spirit, when tested, can endure more than anyone might ever believe possible. And so, the legacy of the Lost Battalion continued, carried forward by the forest that remembered, the families who cherished the names, the historians who preserved the accounts, the soldiers who learned from the example, and the countless people around the world who found in the story not just a piece of military history but a reflection of the strength that exists within every human being. As long as courage is honored, as long as sacrifice is remembered, as long as people seek meaning in the past, the Lost Battalion will never be truly lost. Their story will continue to live, onward through time, as enduring and indomitable as the men who fought in the ravine of the Argonne so many years ago.